Welcome to The Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist oppression and investigate alternative ways of living, for a world based on justice, solidarity and sustainability. Yes, Garingindanami, welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1 FM. It's your local community radio station, and my name's Andy. It is great to be with you again in the ZZZ studio here, broadcasting on the lands of the Jagera and Turrbal people. Of course, depending on where you are, you might be listening to this further afield, both from our radio tower, but also using the magic of the internet. But wherever you are in Australia, you are on Aboriginal country. I'll be with you for the next hour, and today on the show, we will be chatting to Lech Blaine. He is a journalist and writer. He wrote late last year the quarterly essay, which, as the name suggests, comes out 4 times a year. It is a long-form essay about politics and current affairs in Australia and all that. And Lech Blaine wrote a very interesting one about the Larrikin Myth. It's called Top Blokes, the Larrikin Myth, Class and Power. And it covers a lot of ground. I found it very interesting about the ruling class in our society, as in the billionaires and the politicians who represent the interests of money and the ownership class, that they all like to play down and culturally try to claim that they're all larrikins, loving a footy and a beer, including Scott Morrison, our raised in the eastern suburbs, son of a copper Pentecostal Christian, likes to claim that he's just a average footy and beer loving suburban dad. And Lech Blaine interrogates, why is this and what does it mean? How does it manifest politically? And how could it look different for the future? It's a great essay. I recommend reading it. You can get it online, as well as going and supporting those bookstores, which are so constantly under threat. But also, I recommend you hang around for the next hour and have a listen to me and Lech chatting about larrikins, about politics, about rugby league, and about how we can create a better country in the midst of all this. So it's a nice long chat, so I'm going to get straight into it. Hope you enjoy it. And we'll be playing some great tunes in between bits of this interview, so stick around. Could you start off by introducing yourself?
Yeah, my name is Lech Blaine. I'm a writer from country Queensland. I moved to Sydney at the start of last year, published my first book, Car Crash, in April last year, and then a quarterly essay called Top Blokes in September.
Yeah, so I read the quarterly essay that came out late last year and thought it was a really great piece of writing across different genres, I guess, but exploring a very worthwhile topic of class in Australia, and how it is represented and how it manifests politically. What was the idea for this essay?
Yeah, well, I'd been writing about class and about masculinity in my own personal writing in terms of I wrote a memoir and yeah, I was sort of exploring those things, and in that memoir, I was exploring this idea of the larrikin because I grew up in pubs in country Queensland, and my dad was a larrikin, and I was sort of surrounded by these very traditional Australian male figures, and definitely tried to live up to that as a young man, and probably got myself into a fair bit of trouble by doing that. And then it was quite a personal thing. And then I'd also been writing about politics, lots of essays about politics, and usually covering class and the disconnect between Queensland and the rest of the country, or especially between Queensland and Sydney and Melbourne. And then, I was just really interested in the way that Australian politicians have sort of struggled with that identity crisis as well, but just on a lot larger scale, because they're obviously running the country. And so, I was writing about all this stuff, and then Scott Morrison came along, and he really encapsulated everything that I was sort of thinking about, the way that politicians attempted to mimic the mannerisms of ordinary Australians and sort of cast themselves as larrikins. And he was probably obviously Bob Hawke's the first one that comes to mind, but I think that Scott Morrison made a very conscious attempt to sort of mimic those personality traits.
Yeah, well, I mean, Bob Hawke was the sort of Rhodes Scholar who came from generations of politicians who kind of affected the working class, but ScoMo's sort of different in that he's the sort of Puritan wowser from the inner city who has taken on this character. It seems more of an act for him than even for somebody like Hawke.
Oh, definitely, yeah. I think that, I think that Hawke definitely hammed it up a little bit, but he was, there was no denying that, he took a lot of those personality traits to the nth degree. He was an alcoholic. He was a serial womanizer. I'm not glorifying or saying that that's a great thing, but he was pretty legitimate in a lot of ways, often to his detriment in his personal life. Whereas, I think that Morrison takes certainly the vernacular and values and the obsession with sport and mateship and being a bloke and all that sort of stuff. And it's very confected. It doesn't really gel at all with his private life or his personal history.
Yeah, but people moulding their identity to fit certain expectations or certain ideals, that's pretty common, and it's not really... we might not say it's great for them as an individual, as an authentic individual, but it's not of that much significance, whereas politically across the board, this kind of co-option of working class values by a certain side of politics, that's where it becomes a more interesting story, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not, and even within politics, like politicians, that's their job. Like to be a successful politician, you need to reflect the people to some extent, and he's just doing that. He's just done that really skillfully. So I don't think that being a fake necessarily precludes you from political office, because a lot of the best politicians have been quite fake in some ways. I think it's just more interesting the way that it really matches up with this broader movement in the way that conservative parties have started to. The base of conservative parties has changed significantly, and the base of social democratic parties has also changed significantly. And so these conservative parties very much speak the language of the working class and directly try to appeal to them, while at the same time they have made an extremely conscious attempt to whittle away the rights of workers and the benefits of the welfare state, and so they've both sort of gone hand in hand. They speak The Liberal Party speaks a lot more egalitarian language than it did 40 years ago, but their success at actually attacking the working class has been a lot more successful than 40 years ago. And so it's been, a pretty interesting paradox.
And you mentioned as well these business leaders who took on the role of the larrikin while, extracting huge amounts of money out of the working class who work for them, people like from Kerry Packer and Alan Bond to modern-day figures like Twiggy Forrest and Gina Reinhardt.
Yeah, and it's the same thing. I think that they generally have come from really privileged backgrounds, and they're Australia's equivalents of aristocrats in England, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But I think that what the ruling class in Australia has realised is that Australia is quite a different country to Britain. The way that we've developed, at least with white settlement, means that there is an egalitarian streak here. You can't as nakedly create a class system here, and that the best way for them to maintain their power and to maintain an affinity with the general population is to actually act down and to appeal to those people and often to sort of ape their behaviour, which is something that you would just never see from the upper class in England, where the class system is so entrenched.
One of the things that your essay really highlights, and I think it's a very valuable thing to understand politics at this point in time in the Western world, is this kind of transition of political allegiance from an economic basis to a values basis or a cultural basis or identity basis. And you quote Thomas Piketty, whose work Capital and Ideology will probably be quoted a lot in people exploring this, because it's a statistical work that explores what anecdotally a lot of us have seen. Do you think that there's enough awareness of this as a factor in our current political landscape?
It's been quite, it's been explored a lot now, not just by him, but, there's people have been writing books about this for quite a while. But I think that, it obviously wasn't well understood by the political parties themselves, because, especially the social democratic political parties, because they kept on repeating the same mistakes and really entrenching that drift of working class voters away from them. So that's happened right around the world. It's not just an Australian phenomenon. And then, he's obviously studied that, and that's something that a lot of people have sort of felt intuitively, and I felt it intuitively even in the sort of value gap between myself, who had a pretty comfortable middle-class upbringing, and someone like my dad, who had a working-class upbringing. My politics was a lot more based around identity. It was a lot more based around social values. My dad's politics was very, very strongly based around economics and around jobs and around, workers' rights. And so I sort of lived that as a teenager, and then started studying politics, and then obviously started writing about politics over the last few years. And so, it was something that I really felt intuitively, and then once you actually start to unpack it, and I think that there has been, the big sort of moment where it all became overwhelmingly obvious was with Trump and with Brexit, and these results, seeing voters who voted for Barack Obama, working class voters in the sort of Midwestern states, then voting for Donald Trump. I think that and then working class voters in the north of England who voted for Brexit and have gradually switched to the Conservatives. So I think that was really the moment where social democratic parties realised that they couldn't continue to really maintain the same sort of approach to politics.
But as you point out in your essay, in Australia, that transition happened much earlier with John Howard's appeal to the battlers of Australia and his popularity in that kind of Labor heartland of Western Sydney and outer suburbs. Yeah,
and especially in regional Australia. So he Labor's actually done a reasonable job of maintaining working class voters, especially compared to some of the social democratic parties in Europe who have just really capitulated. So Labor certainly hasn't lost them all, and Howard didn't win them all. He was able to win enough to win repeated elections and really change the template for Australian politics. And the leader since him, at least on the Conservative side, who's been most effectively able to really appeal to that same demographic is Scott Morrison. And that's why at the last election you saw the results actually weren't that different to the previous election, but you saw all these really interesting shifts in between Turnbull in 2016 and then Morrison in 2019, where the seats that were the most university educated and were sort of more affluent swung towards Turnbull in 2016. Then the exact reverse happened in 2019. So you saw a lot of those inner city and quite affluent seats swing towards Labor, and a lot of those outer suburban or regional seats or rural seats swing towards Scott Morrison. And the reason why that's significant is not because the voters in that first cohort are sort of somehow inferior or less ethical than the battlers and those other areas. It's just that elections tend to be won in the outer suburbs and in the regions. So the Labor Party, it doesn't really, I don't think, have a path to power unless it is able to more successfully appeal to the outer suburban and regional seats, especially in Queensland, because Labor's just been getting smashed there federally, and they need to find a way to pick up seats there.
There's another factor, though, especially in those Queensland seats, where the swing was not on a primary level so much towards the Liberal Party, but it swung heavily to One Nation and the ultimate co-opter of working class ideas for rural class when Clive Palmer. That was where the swing went, and then preferences went. And so these two parties are a big factor in Australian politics in this way as well, aren't they?
Yeah, totally. The One Nation, not 100%, but a lot of their voters historically have been disenfranchised Labor voters. So that's just a basic reality, is that for Labor to win the next election, or to win any election, they're going to need to win over people who either sympathise with One Nation or have actually voted for One Nation, which is an uncomfortable thing because, as progressives, you vehemently disagree with the values of a party like One Nation. But a lot of those voters, they aren't signing up wholesale to the Liberal Party. Historically, they are just as distrustful of the Liberal Party as they are of Labor. It's just them really, especially in those coal mining seats, registering a protest vote against, like voters who would usually vote for Labor, registering a protest vote against Labor by voting for One Nation and then giving their preferences to the Liberal Party. That can be potentially an even worse situation for Labor if they have 3 seats in the Hunter Valley, which are currently held by Labor, historically held by Labor, but also had massive swings against them at the last election. But they were so safe that they didn't fall, but they could just as easily fall to the Conservative side of politics as well. So it's not just Queensland; it's the Hunter Valley as well. And if you take away those seats, it starts to become very hard to see a sort of electoral path for Labor to win an election, especially a majority.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's go back to the larrikin idea, which I find a very worthwhile study of Australian culture and identity and politics. Like you, I'm from a rural background and have a high appreciation for the larrikin characters of Australia. But one of the things I found interesting in your essay is that the the political figures that you talk about and then your more anecdotal figures of your own family and family friends are mostly men, and this larrikin ideal is mostly a male thing traditionally, and yet politically it's not that there's a massive split gender-wise on who votes for what party. I mean, how do you think gender plays into all of this?
Well, I think that historically it was just the case that the figure that was lionised as a larrikin was male, and that was probably a symptom of just the society, Australia's society at the time, and just broader social realities. And then I think it probably became really well entrenched by when it overlapped with the Anzac tradition, and so once the larrikin sort of became a digger, well, you know, they were all sort of men. So it really entrenched this idea of the larrikin sort of being a bloke. I don't think necessarily that if you look at the idea of a larrikin, and if the basic sort of tenet of a larrikin is that they're anti-authoritarian or they snub their nose at authority, that's obviously got nothing to do with gender. If anything, the people who are doing that the most in modern society are actually women, and the women, the female politicians or the politicians who are throwing their nose at authority the most are generally women. They're the ones who have had to struggle harder to get to the position that they're in. They don't fit those traditional moulds, and that's what larrikins are supposed to be all about. But yeah, it hasn't quite translated to popular imagination. So when someone like Julia Gillard was elected, she probably had a lot of those character traits that you would associate with someone like Bob Hawke, but they weren't seen as being positive when they were exhibited by a woman. And so she was judged for, you know, a lot smaller sins than someone like Bob Hawke. She was actually like lampooned and patronised for a lot of those sort of character traits and the way that she spoke and just some of her personal tastes. And so, yeah, but I do think that things are shifting. And if you look at examples recently, like someone like Grace Tame, who is a classic larrikin and really exhibits a lot of the positive attributes of the larrikin and really takes a piss out of people in power. Like, I don't think that there's innately any reason why we wouldn't consider those people larrikins.
I suppose you cover a lot of ground in your essay, and it is towards the end that you touch on some of these things, gender being one, and another one being mental health and like traditional Australian masculinity, what it means for mental health, which is something that you've written about in your memoir, Car Crash. You've really explored that topic as well, haven't you?
Yeah, I think that's another sort of paradox, is that as a society, we're really, and political leaders really attempt to open up the conversations around mental health while still sort of committing to the same outdated cliches about masculinity and about the way that men should act. And so, I mean, that's probably my more basic or primal project is to sort of just strip the mask off masculinity and do it in an honest way as possible. And so I think that if we start to allow different kinds of leadership into the public realm from, you know, politicians, whether that's male politicians who don't quite fit that larrikin mould, or, you know, female politicians, I think that we will provide more examples for people out there who don't fit that mould and who and make them feel like that they don't need to try and overcompensate, or, you know, that they don't fit in with traditional ideas about Australian masculinity or just Australian identity.
Mm. It's a very interesting one, because there is so much that needs to be unpacked about this, about the way it plays into power in this country, which you've done politically, and about gender and about mental health. But also, do you think that there are good things about that traditional, I suppose, white Australian identity that are worth trying to preserve in an era of, American cultural imperialism, or positive things that come out for it that can be a force for good in politics and society?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I think that that identity and that political tradition has a lot to answer for. It was, this egalitarian idea of Australia's white working class. That community was really the driving force for the White Australia policy. It certainly wasn't perfect, but it did achieve lots of things in terms of the way that the labour market in Australia was constructed, and lots of positive things. And a lot of those things were gradually wound back from, the sort of the beginning of the 80s, and predominantly by Hawke and Keating, but then, Howard sort of took that and ran with it. And so, I think that there are lessons in terms of political solidarity that can be learned from that, and in terms of the way that workers, unite and for a common good. And that might not necessarily, I'm not saying that needs to translate to the white working class in Australia, because I think that the working class in Australia now is so much more diverse than what it was 100 years ago. And I think that if you sort of tap into some of those same underlying themes and sort of values, there's no reason that they can't be sort of translated to this much more diverse, much more sort of socially equal society, and start to achieve some sort of progress for the working class here, which has really been under attack for a significant period of time.
Yeah, I'm interested in talking a bit more about it. But before we go to it, I did notice one thing. The other day when I was trying to contact you, I went on your website and found your CV, and I realised that actually I'd read a lot of your articles in the Monthly, and that I'd enjoyed these articles. You have this really interesting standpoint in your journalism. You're almost like the Monthly's kind of bogan correspondent, writing about the outer suburbs and Ipswich and Toowoomba and rugby league and these things for a monthly audience which, let's face it, is mostly populated by kind of inner city, well-off people. Is that something that you've intentionally cultivated?
No, not at all. Intentionally in the sense that, I've chosen those subjects to write about. But no, it's sort of been pretty random. A lot of those pieces developed quite organically, and you pitch a lot of pieces, and a lot of them the ideas don't get accepted. So, I never thought that I would be able to get a piece up about rugby league, especially a really long one, in the Monthly, but circumstances just sort of conspired to make it happen because of COVID. And so, it's all sort of happened quite organically. But then the quarterly essay obviously came up, and I really took all of the things that I'd been writing about and united them into a single piece. All the things that I've been writing about in my personal writing, and then also the things that I've been writing about in my journalism. And it probably wasn't really until I'd actually written the quarterly essay that I realised that I'd been, just how sort of central those themes were to my writing. Because at the time I wasn't really setting out, I didn't really have a project, I didn't expect to ever even place a piece with the Monthly. And then when I did, I was just sort of throwing out the ideas that I had, and then they were getting published. So I wasn't doing a whole lot of soul searching about what I was trying to do or anything like that. But for you to call it the bogan correspondent for the Monthly, I'd be chuffed with that description. I mightn't have been, 5 years ago, I probably would have been mortified, because that's sort of the cultural heritage that I was trying to run away from. But I'm partly through just life, and then partly through my writing, I've become extremely comfortable with that. And then the good part about that is that you put the writing out there, and then you get lots of feedback from people, both that monthly audience that are exposed to a different way of thinking or different values or different life experiences, but then also all the people who do come from that sort of cultural heritage who are just extremely chuffed that it has a place in these prestigious literary, political publications, and that's an amazing feeling. I definitely didn't set out to do that, but it's been pretty cool.
Yeah, I think there's a value in it where the media and social media exacerbates this, the different cultural tastes of different demographics in our society, and how it gets more and more divergent, and that the viewpoints of these rural and semi-rural areas and these more working class interests aren't often represented in, say, the knowledge class media like the Monthly. I think it's very valuable.
Yeah, and I also don't, I try to explore my own contradictions in all of this. I'd never try to attempt to make myself the voice of the working class, because, as I said, I had a pretty, even though my family background was pretty working class, I had a very easy life, and I've never worked a hard day in my life. So I don't try to make myself to be some sort of oracle or anything like that. I'm very much implicated in the privilege of the knowledge class and this sort of so-called inner city elite. But I do think it's valuable. You don't want to glorify it or make it to seem like it's all virtue or whatever, but it is just valuable for people to have an idea about how people think and what they do, and because a lot of those people, it just so happens, are the people who decide elections as well.
Mm. And rugby league, it's featured prominently in your writing and indeed in the quarterly essay. It's a recurring theme. You're obviously a fan. Do you use it as a kind of metaphor for working class culture, or do you think that rugby league is this really vital part of Australia's current political makeup?
Oh, well, I think that rugby league encapsulates all of those contradictions as well, because it does. It's sort of similar. It comes from a very working class heritage. It's faced all the same sort of social transformations as the Labor Party has. It's certainly not purely a working class activity or sport anymore. It's $1 billion industry, and so I think that it probably, the reason why it features so prominently is A, because I'm a fanatical fan. And B, there's just lots of anecdotes that I can tell drawing from my own life that sort of draw from, that paint a picture about the idea of the battler or the idea of the outsider that rely on rugby league. And C, because it helps explain some of the political, climate in the country, because there is a reason why Scott Morrison reinvented himself as a rugby league fan. It's because in the regional and outer suburban seats in New South Wales and Queensland, it's the dominant social glue. It's the thing that unites. It's not the only thing. There's lots of people who don't in those places that wouldn't be rugby league fans at all. But generally, yeah, it's a massive social unifier, and it's something that historically hasn't been shown much respect by the political or media class, and especially the media class, in inner city Sydney and Melbourne, sort of see it as a sport for buffoons, and the players haven't really helped that, because they consistently act like buffoons. But I think that the reason why it came back up in that essay is probably purely because Scott Morrison has really taken his overnight rugby league fandom and made it a central part of his identity. And I think it's really interesting to explore why he would do that, but also what it is about that people in those seats find appealing, because they historically probably aren't really used to someone in that position who just unabashedly is such a massive rugby league fan.
In the quarterly essay, you do, I guess, draw some ideals for progressive left in Australia that you think can win back power or be a force for good. And a lot of it is about the Labor Party sort of being a bit more centrist, trying to appeal to everybody. Albanese where a lot of people see it as a weakness, his kind of lack of charisma or personality, you kind of see that as a strength, that it can, appeal to a broader audience. It's quite centrist, your ideals of where this should go. Whereas a lot of people see that Larrikin identity as this kind of untapped reservoir of a kind of anti-authoritarian force for more radical politics on, say, climate change or social equality or something like that. Is that something that you've thought about?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's the difference between my own personal views and what it takes to win elections. And my own personal views, aren't going to win elections in Australia, I don't think, based on any recent sort of evidence. So it's about reorientating progressive politics away from just being a thing of identity or a sort of virtue signalling process to actually winning elections, and that's the way that it needs to be based on power, and there's lots of things that you do with power that aren't necessarily. Like, I think that historically it was very much the other way around. I think that Conservatives were much more interested in sort of signalling things about themselves, or that social democratic parties are very much about gaining power, doing whatever it takes to gain power, and then trying to do as much as they can with that power. And I think that that's sort of switched around. So it's not about being, it might sound less radical, but like at the end of the day, and it's not really about I don't think that the lesson with Albanese, for example, is that that everyone needs to be like him. But that's just who, I don't think that he's a particularly charismatic guy, or at least not in the way that someone like Gough Whitlam or Bob Hawke was. That doesn't mean that I don't think that he can win the election. I think that because, for a whole heap of reasons, Australia is at a federal level, leans much more to the Conservative side, and at this point in time, without the sort of social infrastructure provided by the Labor movement that people like Whitlam and Hawke enjoyed, I don't think that a leader that presents any sense of threat is probably going to win. You look at someone like Bill Shorten, he's extremely centrist as well. He wasn't really that radical, and yet lost the unlosable election. So, is someone who presents an extremely left-wing agenda going to win an election, at least at a federal level in Australia at the moment? I don't think so. That's the basic reality. The essay wasn't about sort of me providing a wish list of what I want. It was really about analysing the political realities, and there's, as I said, there's that can be hard, tough and uncomfortable, and it doesn't necessarily totally align with my values or beliefs or what I see as the ultimate society or the ultimate political platform for a so-called larrikin. But that's just where I think things are at the moment.
Yeah, there is a history in Australia of radicals drawing on that larrikin identity, from Henry Lawson to Frank Hardy, the union movement, and even elements of radical environmental movement. But you seem to think that the typical Aussie larrikin is not as radical as they think they are.
Well, yeah, I think that's true, but I also think that all those things, in terms of social movements, I think that they're not completely separate from the political process, but someone like Albanese can't, just by necessity of a two-party system, he can't he needs to win power. Whereas I think that it's an amazing thing that a lot of these social movements are happening around that, and I hope that they continue to happen separately from politics. If we look at what's happened over the past year, especially in terms of the social movement, the marches for women and stuff like that. That's not taking sort of permission from the political class. That's sort of just going out and doing it. I hope that continues, not just with gender, but with the environment and with a whole bunch of other social issues and political issues. And I don't think that I certainly wouldn't be advising any of those movements to take a more sort of centrist approach. Like I think it's really good and healthy that they are really pushing for change in a quite radical way. That will then over time hopefully contribute to the changing complexion of politics in Australia and hopefully, achieve a better future for the country.
All right. Thanks very much, Lech, for chatting with us today.
No worries, mate.
That is Lech Blaine talking to The Paradigm Shift. Hope you enjoyed our little chat. Covered a few different topics and a very interesting one, the role of the larrikin and the working class identity in Australian politics. Of course, for so long it was something that was very important for the left in this country, pushing social equality, workers' rights, things like that. But it has been, recently, over the recent decades, co-opted by the right and by big business, particularly big mining business. And this is one of the interesting things about all this is when these ideas of what it means to be an Australian or a working class person are co-opted by billionaires who are destroying the planet for their own gain, it puts us all at risk. And so it becomes quite pressing what we do about this. And I think there is work to be done trying to reclaim those ideas of the value of being somebody who works, who creates a society, who builds things, and of belonging to a culture and a tradition and a community, even a nation or a more localized community. Those ideas that are so much a part of the working class identity that have slowly shifted away from the left, which is now so often the party of the educated inner city, and drifted into the right. We need to address that, particularly when it comes to climate change, but all kinds of other issues in this country where we may say that some of the richest and most powerful people in this country do not have the best interests of the majority of Australians at heart, but they continually try to position themselves as if they do. And so we need more interesting critique of this like that offered by Lech Blaine, and we need people getting together and working together and talking about what does it really mean to care about Australia, to care about our communities, to care about, the rights of people to live out their own culture, their own freedom. And that is up to all of us. I'm just about out of time on the Paradigm Shift. Hope you enjoyed another show. I certainly did. If you liked hearing Lech Blaine, you can read plenty of his writing. That quarterly essay is available both online and in all good bookstores. And also he wrote a book called Car Crash about his experience of surviving a fatal car crash as a teenager and then struggling to be able to grieve in the middle of a macho Australian identity that sort of stopped him from doing that. He's written lots of other great articles too, which I do recommend. Other than that, I'll be back next week bringing you more of the most interesting and intelligent political critique from this country and around the world. Keep listening to 4ZZZ. See you next week.